At my husband's elite charity gala, I realized I had become nothing more than decoration in my own marriage. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitmore Grand Hotel ballroom, staring at the glittering Manhattan skyline, while waiters in white gloves moved silently through the crowd with trays of champagne. The crystal chandeliers above me reflected against the polished marble floors, casting soft gold light over women in designer gowns and men wearing watches that probably cost more than my first house. 40 years ago, rooms like this used to intimidate me. Now they simply exhausted me. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy silk gown and glanced across the ballroom toward my husband. Richard Whitmore stood near the stage with one hand casually resting in his pocket, while investors and politicians surrounded him like satellites orbiting a sun. At 72, he still carried himself like a man 20 years younger. Silver hair perfectly styled, tailored tuxedo, confident smile. The same smile that once made me believe I would always matter to him. "Richard, your speech tonight was brilliant," a woman purred beside him. Vanessa Cole, 38 years old, blonde, elegant, sharp in the way expensive knives were sharp. She laughed softly and touched Richard's arm as though it already belonged to her. Richard didn't move away. He hadn't moved away from her in months. I watched them from across the room while pretending not to notice. That had become my role lately. Pretending. Pretending I didn't see the late-night phone calls. Pretending I didn't notice how he stopped introducing me to new business partners. Pretending I didn't hear Vanessa refer to me as traditional in that carefully polished tone wealthy people used when they meant obsolete. A violin quartet played near the staircase while guests gathered for the annual Whitmore Foundation fundraiser. Years ago, Richard and I built this foundation together from the ground up. I organized the first charity dinners myself, folded invitations at our kitchen table, called donors personally, cooked food when we couldn't afford caterers. But tonight, my name appeared nowhere on the welcome banners. Whitmore Global Initiative, they read in giant silver letters. No mention of Helen. No mention of the woman who stood beside Richard before there were penthouses and private jets and magazine interviews. "Mrs. Whitmore," a young hostess interrupted gently. "There's been a small seating adjustment." I smiled politely. "Of course there has." She handed me a new table card without meeting my eyes. "Table 27. Near the back of the ballroom, beside the emergency exit." I stared at the card for a moment before folding it calmly into my clutch purse. Years ago, being humiliated would have made my face burn. Now it simply made me tired. I walked toward the rear tables while guests brushed past me without recognition. Half the people in this room probably assumed I was some retired relative Richard invited out of obligation. I reached my table and sat quietly while conversations and laughter echoed around me. From the stage, Richard thanked donors for their loyalty and vision. Vanessa stood close beside him holding a champagne glass, smiling like a future wife already practicing for photographs. "You must be proud of your husband," the man seated beside me said kindly. I looked toward Richard. "I used to think so." Before the man could respond, the ballroom suddenly shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for everyone to notice. Conversations softened. Heads turned toward the grand entrance. A tall older man stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored black suit. Edward Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair International, one of the most powerful men in corporate America. Even Richard straightened slightly when he saw him. I hadn't seen Edward Sinclair in over 30 years, but I recognized him instantly. The same calm eyes, the same quiet presence that made entire rooms rearrange themselves around him. Richard hurried forward with an eager smile. "Edward, what an honor," but Edward barely acknowledged him. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the ballroom until they landed on me sitting alone near the back wall. For one long second, the entire room seemed to disappear. Then Edward Sinclair walked past Richard without stopping, past Vanessa, past investors and politicians and socialites, straight toward my table. My heartbeat slowed, not quickened, slowed, because suddenly I understood that something buried long ago was about to rise to the surface. Edward stopped beside my chair and held out his hand. The ballroom had gone completely silent. "Helen Whitmore," he said softly, "I've been looking for you." For a moment, nobody in the ballroom moved. It was astonishing how quickly power could silence a room. Even the violinists near the staircase stopped playing. Edward Sinclair still held my hand gently, his expression calm, almost thoughtful, as though he had not just walked past the most influential people in Manhattan to speak to a woman hidden beside the emergency exit. Richard recovered first. "Edward," he said with a strained laugh as he approached us, "I had no idea you knew my wife." My wife. Not Helen. Not the woman who helped build his empire. Just my wife. Edward finally turned toward him, though only briefly. "I knew Helen long before anyone in this room knew your name." The air changed after that. I could feel it. Investors who had ignored me all evening suddenly looked uncomfortable. Women who had brushed past my table without a glance now studied me carefully over the rims of their champagne glasses. Vanessa stood near the stage with a frozen smile that did not quite hide the tension in her face. Richard chuckled softly, but I knew that sound. It was the sound he made when something slipped beyond his control. "Well," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "Helen has always preferred staying out of the spotlight." Edward looked at me instead of Richard. "That surprises me." I did not answer immediately. My hands rested calmly in my lap, though my heart felt strangely unsteady. Not frightened, just awake, as though some part of me that had been sleeping for years had suddenly opened its eyes. Edward pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down without asking permission from anyone. That alone shocked the room. Men like Edward Sinclair did not sit at forgotten tables in the back corners of ballrooms. They certainly did not ignore billionaires to do it. A waiter hurried over nervously with fresh champagne. Edward declined with a polite shake of his head. "I remember another gala," he said quietly. "Chicago, 1987. You wore a dark green dress." I stared at him. "You remember that?" Some people are difficult to forget. Richard remained standing beside the table, but his smile had disappeared completely now. I noticed the slight tightness in his jaw. Vanessa finally approached us, graceful and polished as ever. "Mr. Sinclair," she said warmly, "I am Vanessa Cole. I oversee several of the Foundation's social initiatives." Edward nodded once. "Do you?" She smiled brighter, clearly expecting more attention than that. She did not get it. Edward's focus returned to me again. "You disappeared," he said softly. "After your father died, nobody knew where you went." Across the ballroom, I saw Richard's fingers tighten around his champagne glass. He had not expected this conversation. Neither had I. My father's name had not been spoken in rooms like this for decades. I lowered my eyes briefly toward the white linen tablecloth. "Life became busy," I said carefully. Edward studied me for a moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see every compromise I had made over the last 40 years. Every silence, every sacrifice, every time I allowed myself to become smaller so Richard could become larger. "Busy," Edward repeated quietly. "Yes, I suppose that happens." On stage behind us, the large silver screen displayed photographs from the Whitmore Foundation's achievements over the years. Richard shaking hands with senators. Richard at ribbon cuttings. Richard on magazine covers. In every photograph, I was either cropped out or standing somewhere behind him. I had never noticed it before tonight. Or perhaps I had simply refused to. Vanessa placed a manicured hand lightly on Richard's arm. "Your husband has built something extraordinary," she said to me, her tone perfectly pleasant. "He really changed the city." Edward looked directly at her. "Did he?" Silence again. Sharp this time. Vanessa laughed softly, pretending not to notice. But I noticed. Richard noticed too. Edward leaned slightly closer to me, lowering his voice enough that only I could hear. "Him. Your father once told me that you were the smartest person in your family." I almost smiled at that. My father used to say many things before his company collapsed and before illness took him too early. Before I met Richard and convinced myself that love meant helping someone else become important. "That was a long time ago," I replied. Edward's expression remained calm. "Not long enough." Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a slim ivory envelope. No logo. No label. Just my name written across the front in elegant handwriting. Helen Whitmore. He placed it carefully beside my glass of water. "There is something you deserve to know," he said. Across the table, Richard went completely pale. Richard stared at the envelope beside my glass as though it were something dangerous. For the first time that evening, he looked older than his age. Not physically, spiritually, like a man suddenly realizing the room no longer belonged entirely to him. Vanessa noticed it too. She leaned closer to him and whispered something under her breath, but Richard barely reacted. His attention remained fixed on the ivory envelope resting in front of me. I touched it lightly with my fingertips, but did not open it. Not yet. There was a strange power in waiting. Helen, Richard said carefully, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Perhaps this is not the best place for private conversations. Edward Sinclair folded his hands calmly on the table. On the contrary, he replied, I think truth usually arrives exactly where it is needed most. Across the ballroom, guests had stopped pretending not to watch us. I could feel their curiosity moving through the room like cold wind under a door. Wealthy people survived on secrets, and they could smell one from across a ballroom. Richard finally sat down beside me, though I noticed he positioned himself slightly forward, almost as if trying to block Edward from my view. It reminded me of the early years of our marriage, back when Richard still worried someone more powerful might take opportunities away from him, or take me away from him. I had not thought about those years in a very long time. Back then we lived in a tiny apartment in Chicago above a grocery store that never seemed to close. The pipes rattled every winter. The kitchen was barely large enough for two people to stand inside at the same time. Richard owned 2 suits. I hemmed both myself while sitting beside the radiator because we could not afford a tailor. At night, he used to spread business plans across our small dining table while I brewed coffee and corrected spelling errors in his presentations. He was brilliant even then. Ambitious. Restless. But ambition without money is exhausting to watch. Some nights, he would stare silently out the apartment window for nearly an hour, watching expensive cars pass below us on wet city streets. One day, he used to whisper, "People like that will know my name." I believed him. That was the dangerous part. I believed in him more than I believed in myself. My father certainly did not. Arthur Bennett came from old money and older expectations. He believed Richard was charming, but fundamentally hungry in ways that could never truly be satisfied. Be careful with men who need the world to admire them. He warned me once during lunch at our family estate in Connecticut. They eventually stop seeing people. They only see mirrors. I was 27 years old then, too in love to recognize wisdom when it was sitting directly across from me. After my father's company collapsed during the recession, everything changed quickly. The estate was sold. Most of the family accounts disappeared into legal settlements and debt payments. My father died 18 months later from heart complications that doctors politely blamed on stress. During those months, Richard became my entire world. He held my hand at the funeral. He promised we would rebuild everything together. And for many years, I believed we had. Edward's voice pulled me back to the present. Your father once saved my career, he said quietly. I looked up sharply. Richard said nothing. Edward continued calmly. Most people think Arthur Bennett only lost money during the recession. That is not true. He protected people too, including me. I swallowed slowly. My father rarely spoke about business troubles at home. I did not know that. There are many things you do not know, Edward replied. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I am sure this is all very fascinating, she said lightly. But perhaps tonight should remain focused on the foundation. Edward finally looked directly at her again. Do you know where the original funding for the Whitmore Foundation came from? Vanessa opened her mouth confidently, then stopped. Richard answered before she could. Edward, enough. His tone was sharper now, dangerous in a quieter way. Edward ignored him completely. The first $200,000 came from Helen. The room around us suddenly felt colder. I stared at Richard slowly. What is he talking about? Richard loosened his tie slightly. Helen, this is not necessary. But now memories were beginning to move through my mind like old photographs pulled from dusty boxes. My father's final trust account. The paperwork I signed shortly after the funeral. Richard telling me it was temporary. Just enough capital to help launch the company before investors arrived. I had not thought about that money in decades. Edward slid another document across the table toward me. You should read the names on the incorporation papers, he said softly. Richard stood up, so quickly his chair nearly tipped backward. Every sound in the ballroom seemed painfully clear after Richard stood up. The soft clink of champagne glasses. The distant hum of conversation near the bar. The faint scrape of his chair against the marble floor. For years, I had watched my husband control rooms with ease. Investors listened when he spoke. Reporters quoted his opinions like scripture. Politicians invited him onto private yachts during election seasons. Richard Whitmore built his entire life around appearing untouchable. But standing there beneath the chandelier light, Staring at the documents on the table, he no longer looked untouchable. He looked cornered. "Helen," he said quietly, "this conversation can wait until we get home." Home. The word felt strange suddenly, like something borrowed from another life. I lowered my eyes to the papers Edward had placed before me. The incorporation documents were old, cream-colored pages with slightly faded ink. I recognized Richard's signature immediately. Mine too. But beneath our names was something I had completely forgotten. Founder equity distribution. 60% assigned to Helen Bennett Whitmore. My breath caught softly in my throat. Richard stepped closer. "You never handled the business side," he said quickly. "Those early drafts changed years ago." Edward remained perfectly calm. "No," he said. "They did not." Richard turned sharply toward him. "You have no right involving yourself in my marriage." Edward's expression barely shifted. "I am not involving myself in your marriage. I am correcting a very old injustice." Vanessa sat frozen beside us now, her carefully polished confidence beginning to crack around the edges. She looked from Richard to me, then back to the documents on the table. "Richard," she asked softly, "what exactly is this?" He ignored her completely. That told me more than any answer could have. Around us, guests pretended to return to their conversations, but nobody truly had. Wealthy people had a talent for eavesdropping while appearing elegant. I could practically feel hundreds of silent questions floating through the ballroom. I picked up the papers slowly. My hands remained steady, though inside me something old and painful had begun to wake up. Not anger. Something colder. Recognition. Tiny memories started fitting together with terrifying precision. The years Richard insisted I stay away from financial meetings because they were too stressful. The accountants who stopped speaking directly to me. The signatures I was asked to provide during vacations or charity events while distracted by guests and cameras. I remembered once asking Richard if my father's original investment had ever been repaid. He kissed my forehead and laughed softly. "Sweetheart, without me, that money would have disappeared years ago." At the time, I believed him. I had believed almost everything he told me. Edward leaned closer to me slightly. "Your father protected those shares very carefully before he died," he said. "He understood Richard better than you did." I swallowed hard. My father's face flashed through my mind with sudden, painful clarity. The tired lines around his eyes during those final months. The way he used to pause before speaking whenever Richard entered a room. Back then, I thought it was disapproval. Now I wondered if it had been fear. Richard finally lowered his voice. "Edward, enough damage has been done tonight." Damage. That word settled heavily inside me, because suddenly I realized something devastating. Richard was not worried about hurting me. He was worried about losing control. There was a difference. A massive one. Vanessa stood slowly from her chair. "I think perhaps I should speak with the board members," she murmured awkwardly. "Sit down," Richard snapped quietly. The sharpness in his tone startled even him. Vanessa's face flushed immediately. For a brief second, I saw humiliation flicker across her expression. Strange how quickly powerful people become fragile when the room changes direction. Edward watched Richard carefully. "Does she know about the pending sale?" he asked. Silence. Absolute silence. My eyes moved slowly toward Richard. "Sale." He loosened his tie again, avoiding my gaze now. "It is just a preliminary discussion." Edward looked at me instead. Sinclair International was approached 3 months ago regarding the acquisition of Whitmore Global. My stomach tightened. 3 months. Richard had said nothing to me. Not one word. "That is confidential information," Richard said coldly. Edward nodded once. "It was." Then he reached into his jacket pocket again and removed a second envelope. Smaller this time. Thicker. "There is one more thing your father left behind," he said quietly. "And Richard has spent 40 years hoping you would never discover it." The second envelope felt heavier than the first. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of weight that arrives before a storm finally breaks open over the ocean. My fingers rested against the thick cream paper while Richard watched me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Fear. Real fear. For decades, my husband mastered every room he entered. He negotiated billion-dollar deals without raising his voice. He dismantled competitors with polite smiles and expensive dinners. Yet now, standing beneath crystal chandeliers with half of Manhattan pretending not to stare, he looked like a man watching his own reflection crack apart. "Helen," he said quietly, "whatever Edward told you tonight is being exaggerated." I looked at him slowly. You have not even asked what is inside the envelope. That silenced him immediately. Edward remained calm beside me, almost detached, though there was something deeply personal in the way he watched Richard unravel. Open it, he said softly. I slid one finger beneath the seal. The paper inside was old, much older than the incorporation documents. I unfolded it carefully and immediately recognized my father's handwriting. Elegant, precise. Arthur Bennett wrote every letter like a man who believed words mattered. My dearest Helen, if you are reading this, then circumstances have unfolded exactly as I feared they might. My throat tightened before I could continue. Around us, the ballroom noise faded into distant echoes. There was only my father's voice now, living quietly inside faded ink. Richard once again attempted to interrupt. This is inappropriate. Edward did not even look at him. No, it is overdue. I continued reading. Richard is ambitious in ways you still mistake for devotion. He loves admiration more than stability, and he fears irrelevance more than failure. I pray I am wrong about him. But if I am not, then one day you may discover that the empire you helped him build was never truly surrendered. I stopped breathing for a moment. My eyes moved lower down the page. The original controlling shares of Whitmore Holdings were placed into a protected trust under your legal ownership. They cannot be transferred, diluted, or sold without your direct authorization. Not his. Yours. A strange stillness settled inside me. Not shock exactly. Something larger. Like waking from a very long sleep and realizing the world had continued moving around you while you dreamed. I slowly lifted my eyes toward Richard. He looked exhausted suddenly, older than I had ever seen him. You knew, I whispered. He rubbed one hand across his face. Helen, listen to me carefully. The company evolved. Over the years, structures changed. Lawyers handled things. But you knew. He said nothing. Silence can answer questions more honestly than words ever do. Vanessa looked completely lost now. Richard, she said softly, what does this mean? He turned toward her sharply. Not now. But now was all that existed anymore. There would never be another moment after this where things could return to normal. I looked back at my father's letter. There was one final paragraph written near the bottom of the page. Never allow anyone to convince you that kindness means surrendering your place in the world. You were born with more strength than you realize. Tears almost reached my eyes then, but they never fell. I had spent years believing grief made women weak in rooms like this. But grief was not weakness. It was memory refusing to disappear. Edward spoke carefully beside me. Richard approached Sinclair International because he believed the acquisition would finalize before you discovered the trust protections. My stomach tightened slowly. He was going to sell the company. Most of it, Edward replied. And because the controlling shares remain legally tied to you, the transaction cannot proceed without your approval. Richard finally sat down heavily in his chair. The confidence that once defined him seemed to drain away piece by piece beneath the ballroom lights. You do not understand the pressure I have been under, he said quietly. Markets changed. Investors demanded expansion. I stared at him calmly. So you planned to sell the company built with my father's money without telling me. I was protecting you. I almost smiled at that. Amazing how men confuse control with protection when they no longer recognize the difference. Across the ballroom, the charity event continued awkwardly around us. Waiters still carried champagne trays. A jazz pianist quietly replaced the violin quartet. Wealthy guests resumed smiling conversations while secretly watching every movement at our table. But none of it mattered anymore. Because for the first time in decades, I finally understood something terrifying. Richard Whitmore had never expected me to remember who I was. Richard did not speak for almost a full minute after my father's letter left my hands. He simply sat there beneath the warm chandelier light, staring at the tablecloth, while conversations quietly resumed around us. The ballroom had recovered enough to continue functioning, but not enough to forget what everyone had witnessed. People were careful now when they looked in our direction. Careful in the way wealthy people become careful whenever power begins changing owners. Vanessa finally reached for her champagne glass, though her hand trembled slightly before she steadied it. Surely this can all be resolved privately, she said with a brittle smile. There is no reason for tonight to become uncomfortable. Edward Sinclair looked at her calmly. For some people, discomfort arrives decades too late. I folded my father's letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Strange how a few pages of paper could rearrange an entire life. Across the stage, a speaker from the foundation attempted to restart the evening program, thanking donors for their generosity and commitment to the future of New York City. Applause followed politely, but weakly. Half the room remained distracted by our table near the back wall. Richard slowly leaned toward me. "Helen," he said quietly, "we need to leave." I studied him for a moment. The man sitting beside me no longer resembled the husband who once held my hand in crowded subway stations while dreaming aloud about success. Somewhere along the way, ambition had consumed softness entirely. What remained was polished, powerful, empty. "No," I replied gently. "I think I would like to stay." He blinked at me, surprised by the firmness in my voice. I realized then how long it had been since I contradicted him publicly. Years perhaps, maybe decades. Little by little, I had adjusted myself around Richard's moods, Richard's schedules, Richard's ambitions. I stopped voicing opinions at business dinners because he once told me investors preferred simplicity in wives. I stopped attending meetings because he said financial stress was unhealthy for me. I stopped correcting him when he rewrote our history during interviews. "I built this company from nothing," he would proudly say while cameras flashed. And beside him, I smiled quietly like a woman listening to someone else describe her own life. Edward interrupted my thoughts softly. "Do you know why your father trusted me with those documents?" I looked toward him. "Because he thought one day I might need them." "No," Edward said carefully. "Because he believed one day you would finally be ready to see them." That landed harder than I expected. Ready. Such a simple word. Yet suddenly I understood something painful. The documents had existed for years. The truth had existed for years. But I had spent most of my marriage trying to preserve peace instead of examining reality. Peace can become a prison when silence is the price of keeping it. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside Richard. "I still do not understand why any of this matters now," she said. "The company is thriving." Edward's expression remained unreadable. "Because the acquisition meeting is Monday morning." Her face lost color instantly. So she had known. Not everything perhaps, but enough. Richard closed his eyes briefly as if exhausted. "Vanessa," he muttered quietly, "please stop talking." But it was too late for careful management now. Tiny details were connecting themselves inside my mind with frightening speed. The sudden increase in private board meetings. The unexplained legal consultations. Richard traveling constantly during the past 6 months, while becoming strangely attentive whenever divorce laws appeared in news stories or television programs. One evening, he casually asked whether I had ever considered downsizing after retirement. At the time, I thought he meant the Connecticut house. Now I wondered if he meant my entire place in his future. "Were you planning to leave me after the sale?" I asked quietly. Richard looked at me sharply. "Helen, do not do this here." Which meant yes. Not directly, not honestly, but yes. The answer sat clearly between us anyway. Edward stood slowly from his chair. "There is another issue you should know about," he said to me. Richard rose immediately. "Enough." The word came out harsher this time. Several nearby guests turned toward us again. Edward ignored him completely. 3 board members already signed preliminary agreements supporting the acquisition. My stomach tightened slightly. And your signature was forged on 2 authorization drafts last month." Everything inside me went still. Completely still. Richard said nothing. He did not deny it. He simply looked away toward the glittering Manhattan skyline beyond the ballroom windows. In that moment, I realized something devastatingly simple. My husband had spent 40 years building an empire while quietly erasing the woman who made it possible. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself I would never notice. The ballroom suddenly felt too warm, too bright. Every chandelier above me seemed harsher now, throwing sharp reflections across polished marble and crystal glasses while Richard stood beside our table, avoiding my eyes. Forged. The word echoed quietly inside my mind with terrifying clarity. Not manipulated. Not hidden. Forged. My husband had signed my name on legal documents connected to the sale of the company my father helped create. And somehow, the humiliation hurt less than the realization that Richard truly believed I would never discover it. Edward remained standing beside the table, calm and composed while the entire atmosphere around us shifted further. I noticed board members whispering near the bar, investors checking their phones, a A senator's wife openly staring in our direction without pretending otherwise anymore. Wealthy rooms survive on appearances until the exact moment appearances begin collapsing. Then everyone quietly searches for the nearest exit. Richard finally spoke again, his voice low and controlled. The signatures were temporary placeholders during negotiation drafts. Nothing was finalized. I looked at him carefully. Did you plan to tell me before or after the company disappeared? He exhaled heavily through his nose. Helen, you are making this sound criminal. Edward answered before I could. That depends entirely on what investigators decide. Richard's jaw tightened instantly. For the first time all evening, genuine anger flickered across his face. Not at Edward. At me. As though my awareness itself had become betrayal. Strange how some men resent women most the moment those women stop remaining blind. Vanessa slowly stood from her chair again. I think perhaps I should head home, she murmured awkwardly. Sit down, Vanessa. Richard's voice cut sharply through the table once more. Several nearby guests glanced toward us immediately. Vanessa lowered herself back into her seat, embarrassed now in a way I almost recognized. For years, I had occupied that exact emotional space beside Richard. The careful silence, the instinct to avoid displeasing him publicly, the constant adjustment of tone and expression to preserve his image. Suddenly, I saw myself in her for one brief, uncomfortable second. Not the younger version of me, the weaker version. Edward calmly reached for his water glass. Monday morning's acquisition meeting will not proceed quietly anymore. Richard laughed once under his breath, though there was no humor in it. You are enjoying this far too much. No, Edward replied softly. I simply dislike watching decent people erased. The words settled heavily inside me. Erased. Yes, that was exactly what had happened. Not suddenly. Slowly. Carefully. Over decades. Richard never shouted at me. Never humiliated me openly. That would have been easier to recognize. Instead, he reduced me in small, elegant ways. He stopped asking my opinion in meetings. Stopped introducing me as his partner and began calling me supportive. During interviews, he spoke about sacrifice as though he alone understood the concept. Every year, my world became slightly smaller while his became enormous. And because the shrinking happened gradually, I adjusted to it without noticing. Until tonight. Until Edward Sinclair walked across a ballroom and reminded everyone that I existed. I folded my father's letter once more and slipped it carefully into my purse. Who else knows about the trust? I asked quietly. Edward answered immediately. The original attorneys. 2 surviving board members from the founding years. And now you. Richard rubbed both hands across his face slowly. Helen, listen to me. You have no idea how complicated these structures became over the decades. There were acquisitions, mergers, tax reorganizations, and affairs. The question left my mouth before I could stop it. Vanessa froze beside him. Richard stared at me in complete silence, which again was answer enough. Not necessarily physical betrayal. Somehow that felt almost irrelevant now. Worse than that was emotional replacement. Vanessa had not appeared accidentally. She had been slowly stepping into spaces Richard once reserved for me. Business dinners, charity planning meetings, vacation conversations, public photographs. She was not simply another woman. She was my successor. The newer, younger version of the wife Richard wished the world to see beside him. It was not like that, he said finally, though weakly. I looked toward the ballroom stage where giant silver letters still displayed the Whitmore Foundation logo behind smiling photographs of Richard shaking hands with world leaders. My husband had spent years building monuments to himself while quietly removing the woman who stood beside him before any of those cameras existed. Edward checked his watch calmly. Your attorneys should arrive within 20 minutes. Richard's head snapped upward. You called attorneys? Edward's expression remained unreadable. No, Helen's father did. 40 years ago. I stared at him in confusion. Edward nodded once toward the elevators across the ballroom lobby. Arthur Bennett anticipated this exact night. He arranged legal protections that activate automatically if unauthorized transfer attempts occur involving Helen's shares. Richard went completely still. And suddenly, beneath all the gold light and expensive perfume and quiet jazz music, I realized something extraordinary. My father had never underestimated me. Only my husband had. The elevators opened less than 15 minutes later. Two attorneys stepped into the ballroom, carrying slim leather portfolios while conversations around the room quietly faded again. Nobody announced them. Nobody needed to. The atmosphere shifted the moment they entered, like thunder arriving before rain. Richard saw them immediately and stood so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly across the marble floor. One of the attorneys was an older woman with silver hair pulled neatly into a low knot. The other appeared younger, sharp-eyed, composed, carrying himself with the calm confidence of someone who understood exactly why he had been summoned. They walked directly toward our table without hesitation. "Mrs. Whitmore," the older attorney said gently as she approached me. "My name is Diane Mercer. Your father retained our firm in 1986. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Defeat flickered across his face so quickly most people would have missed it. But I saw it. Diane placed a folder carefully in front of me. Under the instructions of Arthur Bennett, these documents were sealed unless specific transfer violations occurred involving your ownership shares. Around us, nearby guests openly stared now. Nobody pretended otherwise anymore. Even the jazz pianist near the stage had stopped playing. Richard looked toward Diane sharply. "This is completely unnecessary." Diane met his gaze calmly. "Forgery involving corporate ownership is never unnecessary, Mr. Whitmore." Vanessa slowly pushed her chair backward from the table. "I truly did not know about any of this," she said quietly. For the first time all evening, her voice sounded sincere. Not polished, not strategic, just frightened. Richard did not even acknowledge her. His attention remained fixed entirely on the folder now sitting before me like a doorway into another life. I opened it slowly. Inside were copies of trust agreements, ownership structures, legal protections, and board authorizations spanning decades. My name appeared everywhere. Helen Bennett Whitmore, majority controlling shareholder, permanent trust beneficiary, final authority regarding sale authorization. I felt strangely detached reading it all, as though I were discovering the biography of another woman entirely. A stronger woman. A woman who had once mattered inside her own life. Edward remained standing beside me while Diane continued speaking. "Your father feared emotional coercion more than financial fraud," she explained quietly. "He specifically requested that independent legal review be triggered if transfer attempts occurred without your direct legal consultation." Emotional coercion. Even now, decades after his death, my father understood the danger I never saw clearly myself. Richard laughed once under his breath, exhausted and bitter. "Arthur Bennett never trusted me," Edward answered calmly. "He trusted Helen. That was the difference." Silence settled over the table again. Heavy, irreversible. Across the ballroom windows, Manhattan glittered against the dark night sky, while camera flashes occasionally sparked from distant corners where guests discreetly photographed the unfolding disaster. Tomorrow morning, rumors would spread across boardrooms, charity circles, and private clubs throughout the city. Richard Whitmore's carefully polished empire was beginning to crack publicly. And for the first time, he could not control the narrative. Diane slid one final document toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore, under the trust provisions, you have immediate authority to suspend all pending acquisition activity effective tonight." My fingers rested against the page. Such a simple action. One signature. One decision. 40 years of silence balanced quietly on the edge of a pen. Richard lowered his voice carefully. "Helen, think about what you are doing." I looked at him calmly. "I am beginning to." His expression hardened slightly. "You could destroy everything we built." "We." Strange word. Suddenly it sounded dishonest. "No," I replied softly. "I think you already tried to do that yourself." Vanessa stood fully now, clutching her purse tightly against her side. "Richard," she whispered, "why did you tell me the company would belong to us after the merger?" The question landed like shattered glass across the table. Richard stared at her in disbelief. Too late, both of them realized what she had accidentally revealed. Around us, several nearby guests visibly reacted. Tiny expressions, raised eyebrows, quick glances exchanged over champagne glasses. In elite circles, public embarrassment spreads faster than wildfire. Richard's face darkened instantly. Vanessa stopped talking, but panic had already loosened her control. "You said Helen would keep the Connecticut house and receive a settlement after the sale," she blurted softly. "You told me everything was finalized." I did not react outwardly. Not even then. That surprised me most. Years ago, hearing another woman discuss my marriage so casually might have shattered me completely. But now I simply felt tired. Deeply tired. Because betrayal loses some of its power once illusion disappears. Edward looked toward me quietly. You do not have to decide everything tonight. Diane nodded in agreement. But legally, you should protect your position immediately. I stared down at the suspension authorization resting beneath my hand. Then slowly, calmly, without looking at Richard even once, I signed my name. The sound of my pen touching paper was surprisingly quiet. After everything that had happened that evening, after decades of silence and compromise and carefully managed appearances, the moment itself lasted less than 3 seconds. One signature. That was all. Yet the instant I placed the pen down beside the documents, something shifted permanently inside the ballroom. Richard seemed to understand it immediately. His shoulders lowered slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to see exhaustion finally breaking through the polished image he had spent a lifetime constructing. Around us, conversations resumed carefully, though the room no longer belonged to him the way it once had. People still respected wealth. They always would. But Manhattan's elite respected vulnerability far less than failure. And tonight, Richard Whitmore looked vulnerable. Diane Mercer gathered the signed documents calmly and placed them back into her leather portfolio. The acquisition process is officially suspended effective immediately, she announced quietly. Additional legal review will begin Monday morning. Richard stared at the table for several seconds before finally speaking. Helen, he said softly, 40 years cannot end because of one misunderstanding. I almost smiled at that word. Misunderstanding. Such a gentle label for betrayal carefully maintained over decades. I looked at him for a long moment, perhaps longer than I had truly looked at my husband in years. The silver hair, the expensive tuxedo, the tired eyes. Beneath all, the success and attention and ambition, Richard suddenly looked exactly like the young man from that tiny Chicago apartment so many years ago. Still hungry, still terrified of losing status, still chasing admiration like it could somehow fill the emptiness inside him. No, I replied quietly. 40 years ended long before tonight. I just finally noticed. Vanessa stood frozen near the table, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. Earlier that evening, she moved through the ballroom with effortless confidence, smiling beside Richard like a woman already imagining her future. Now she looked uncertain and painfully young. Not evil, just foolish enough to mistake proximity to power for security. She opened her mouth slightly as though wanting to apologize, then thought better of it. Edward Sinclair remained beside me in complete silence, while waiters carefully resumed carrying champagne trays through the ballroom. Somewhere near the stage, the jazz pianist began playing again, soft notes drifting beneath the endless glittering lights above us. It struck me then how strange life truly was. A marriage could collapse quietly at table 27, while 50 feet away people continued discussing stock markets and vacation homes over expensive wine. The world rarely paused for heartbreak. Richard finally stood from his chair slowly. We should leave, he said. But there was no authority left in the sentence anymore. Only habit. I reached for my purse and carefully placed my father's letter inside. You should stay, I answered gently. This is your event. His expression tightened slightly. Helen. No, I interrupted softly. I spent too many years leaving rooms so you could remain comfortable in them. Silence settled between us again. Not angry silence. Just final silence. The kind that arrives when two people finally stop pretending they are still standing inside the same story. Edward offered me his arm politely. Your car is waiting downstairs. Richard looked toward him sharply. You arranged this? Edward's expression remained calm. Your wife deserves at least one evening where someone planned ahead for her. I stood slowly from my chair. Around the ballroom, people watched openly now. Some with sympathy, some with fascination. Some already calculating what this scandal might mean for future business alliances. But strangely, for the first time all night, I no longer cared what any of them thought, because something far more important had returned to me. Myself. As Edward and I walked toward the grand ballroom exit, nobody stopped us. The chandeliers glowed overhead like frozen stars while Manhattan shimmered beyond the towering windows in endless silver light. Halfway to the doors, I paused briefly and looked back one final time. Richard still stood beside the table alone now. Vanessa had disappeared. Board members whispered quietly near the stage. Investors checked their phones nervously. The empire Richard spent 40 years building no longer looked untouchable. It looked fragile, human, temporary. And suddenly, I understood the real tragedy of the evening. Richard did not lose his company tonight. He lost the one person who loved him before he became powerful enough to forget what love actually was. Outside, cool autumn air wrapped around me as I stepped onto Fifth Avenue beside the waiting car. The city lights stretched endlessly through the darkness, while traffic moved below like rivers of gold. Edward opened the passenger door gently before looking at me with quiet respect. "Where would you like to go, Helen?" I stared out at Manhattan for a moment before answering. For the first time in decades, the future felt entirely mine again. "Somewhere peaceful," I said softly. "I think I would finally like to hear my own thoughts."